All right, good afternoon, everyone. I know we still are going to have people joining us for the next couple minutes, but want to dive right in and make good use of our time together. First off, happy 2023. Great to see some of you that I haven't seen in a while. Hope the year is off to a good start for all of you. Certainly appreciate this is a very busy time of year, especially for our advocacy partners. So we really appreciate you taking the break from your day to join this conversation. And I will say we were initially scheduled for an hour and a half, and we're really hoping to keep that to just an hour over the lunch hour today and get you on and back off to your weekends. We are expecting a fairly solid group of partners with us today. So in the interest of time, we are just asking you all to please go ahead and chat your name, pronouns, and organization in the chat. And again, great to see those of you that are just joining us. I do want to take a moment to introduce the Colorado Health Foundation policy team. For those of you I don't know, I'm Alexis Waitman. I'm a senior policy officer here at the foundation. Here in the virtual meeting room, I also have my teammates, Kyle Rojas Leglider, our senior director of policy. And we have some new faces. Emily Rader and Lauren Morales have recently joined our team as policy officers. And finally, we have Austin Montoya, who's our senior communications officer who oversees a lot of our public opinion research and our annual Pulse poll. So speaking of polls, we are going to try to make this an interactive session today, and we're going to be using the Zoom poll function throughout the presentation to gather feedback and quick reactions from all of you. We really want this to be participatory. So just to test out our technology, make sure everything is working, we do have a quick test poll that we want to just launch to see who is in the room with us today. So hopefully you have seen two poll questions pop up. If you can just take a moment to make your selections and hit submit, we'll get a better sense of who is in the room with us today. If anyone is not seeing the poll, you can include that in the chat. It looks like we are getting to a critical mass, so we'll go ahead and end that poll. Great, so it looks like so far in the room today, we have a lot of organizations that are working statewide and some advocacy newbies, welcome, as well as quite a few veterans. So again, thank you for being with us today. Let's go ahead and launch our presentation. So why are we here? Again, really happy to have some time with all of you to give an update on an effort that we at the Colorado Health Foundation have been working on for the better part of a year now. I believe most everyone on the call is familiar with the Health Foundation. We are a statewide private foundation that works to bring good health and well-being and reach for Coloradans, with a focus on promoting health equity and racial justice. In addition to our funding and grant-making activity, which is perhaps how many people know us, we are also engaged in policy advocacy work within our legal limitations of our tax status. Typically, our policy engagement has been around certain issues related to our mission. However, in recent years, we have really begun an exploration of not just what policies become law in Colorado, but also the underlying how. How do Colorado's state government institutions operate? How do the ins and outs of introducing, crafting, and implementing policy decisions affect whose voices are heard in the process and who has power? And so we've really been digging in, thinking about how the rules of the game have an impact on which voices influence those policy decisions in our state. So as some of you may recall, we conducted a series of conversations with many of you on the Zoom meeting today in fall of 2021. And that was really focused on hearing opinions from advocacy organizations. And we did issue a report last February. Then building off what we learned in those conversations, we did a second round of interviews with those that we're calling kind of insiders on the inside of the system, for better or worse terminology. Those are current and former legislators, current and former legislative staff, and current and former lobbyists. So we've heard a lot and really just wanted to take a moment to share back and reflect some of what we've been hearing. and get some input from all of you. So that's just a little bit of background. Our goals today are really to share those findings from those most recent round of conversations that we've had, and to highlight some of the similarities and differences between the audiences that we've talked to. And again, we really do want this to be interactive. You are the first audience that we're sharing this information with, so we want to have some time to reflect on what we've heard and do some collective sense making, and again, get some feedback from all of you about what resonates, what you have questions about, and where you think there might be some opportunities. So in terms of where we're going with our time today, again, for those of you just joining, we are going to try to keep this to an hour. So maybe an hour and 5 minutes if we need it. But we are going to do a brief presentation of what we've heard. After each section, we are going to pause and ask for some feedback from all of you. Then we will have a short amount of time to break into some small group discussions and reflections, and then we'll come back together and talk about next steps. So just as a note of housekeeping, I know we are all very much Zoom pros, probably more than we would like to be at this stage in the game. But if you do have questions as we're going, please feel free to use the chat function. We'll try to answer those in real time. And as you are listening to the presentation of results, please just take note of things that resonate, things you have curiosities about, and we'll have time to dig into those in the small groups. All right, so now on to the actual content. What did we do? So as mentioned, in fall of 2021, we had conversations with 25 organizations that engage in advocacy work. We recognize we did not talk to the entire advocacy universe in Colorado, but we were really deliberate about seeking a range of perspectives from different organizations, especially organizations that were led by or centered on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, so BIPOC communities. So that's who we invited to this room today. This represents that group of advocacy partners that we initially reached out to in 2021. And we really see this as a beginning point for many conversations that we hope to see in the future. So thank you for being here and for being our first point of feedback and conversation. If you had a chance to look at the reports that were shared in advance, you will notice that the first round of interviews covered a lot of ground. We looked at the state legislature, administrative processes, statewide ballot measures, as well as the judicial system. We heard a lot of feedback from all of you. Many barriers and opportunities were surfaced in each of these categories. However, in some sense-making activities we did with many of you earlier last year, we decided to really dig in and explore deeper around the state legislature as well as administrative rulemaking. So just last fall, we conducted a second round of conversations with those that really were on the inside of the system. So in order to develop a robust and nuanced understanding of the strengths and challenges around the state legislature, we wanted to talk to those who are inside the walls of the Capitol building. So we sought out a range of perspectives from both current and former legislators, lobbyists, and legislative staff. So we completed 19 additional conversations. I will certainly acknowledge this was not a comprehensive survey, but in any way, shape, or form, but we really did seek to gather a range of perspectives from different political affiliations, ideologies, portions of the state. And we think there are some really interesting themes and ideas that we would like to dig in further. And I will say also, we heard a lot of information. All of it was valuable and interesting, but we're really focusing in on the ideas offered around how the state legislature could operate differently to make processes and procedures more inclusive, equitable, and racially just. So that's really the lens that we're bringing to all of this. So in the second round of conversations, we divided our conversations up into 3 parts. We looked at the bill development and approval process. So this was really looking at the entire bill life cycle from concept to bill passage. We dug in around the state budget, so looking at the Joint Budget Committee activity, SMART Act hearings, and additional procedures for creating and passing the annual budget. And then recognizing that the work certainly does not stop once a bill is passed, we explored the handoff to administrative rulemaking. So really the implementation of those laws by various state agencies, boards and commissions, and the governor's office. All of these conversations were pretty open-ended. We asked everyone what works well now, what are the barriers, and then we asked everyone to take a magic wand and to suspend politics, people, and money, and ask them what they would do to, again, make our processes and procedures more equitable and just. So that's kind of the framing. In the materials that we did send out in advance, we did share 2 versions of the reports summarizing the feedback we've heard from the various conversations. The most recent one is very much in draft form and is really just for conversation today. We anticipate finalizing that and sharing that out in the near future. As you are skimming through those reports, they're similar in how the information is presented. We shared out themes in alphabetical order. The frequency of mention for each of these themes is included in parentheses. We really just shared out what we heard. There's no interpretation of on any of those, again, just sort of reporting out. And I will say just, yes, we will get those reports linked in the chat. Thanks, Melanie. The frequency of mention does not equate to level of importance necessarily. So I just wanted to mention that as framing. So for the purpose of sharing the information today, we wanted to show where there were similarities and differences from the different audiences. So for each slide we're going to go through, we'll present ideas or observations that were unique to what we are calling the insiders in blue. We recognize this is not perfect or ideal language here. We're not trying to create a binary insider-outsider dynamic, but we're using this admittedly insufficient term to refer to those who are inside the legislative system, so legislators, staff, and lobbyists. We then will share some commonalities and themes that we heard from our advocacy partners that were unique to sort of your perspectives. And then in a green circle, we will share ideas and themes that we heard from both groups. So that's how we're trying to present this information. So now onto the content. For the first area we looked at, again, was the bill development and approval process. We are today going to focus in specifically on the barriers that people are encountering, again, with an eye towards promoting equity and transparency, as well as where there are ideas to make things better and to really promote equity. That said, I don't want to diminish. We did hear a lot of positives that things are working well in Colorado. Not all is broken. Many and people that we talked to acknowledge that it's much better to be working here in Colorado than in other states or at the federal level. And we have a lot of things that are going well for us. So certainly we have open public meeting laws. Every bill gets a public hearing. We have decent transparency. Information is available on our websites if you know where to look and have access to the technology, and also recognition that there are policies on both sides of the aisle who are truly prioritizing community voice and input. The strength of our nonprofit advocacy community was also continually lifted up as a real strength and asset here in Colorado. So now on to the barriers. Again, we heard a lot. So as we were talking to those inside of the system, one thing that came up really time and time again was the fact that here in Colorado, we have a citizen legislature. Having this part-time citizen legislature introduces a dynamic where legislators are generalists, or they may be an expert on a single topic. However, they are expected to legislate on everything that crosses their path. The result here that we heard is that really that results in legislators relying on career lobbyists and other experts to get their work done. We also heard related to this that there is a lack of institutional knowledge in our legislature. This is related closely to a lot of what we heard around term limits, but that there's a sense that there's a general lack of institutional history within the legislature at any given time. And again, this results in legislators turning to lobbyists to get that history and recognizing that lobbyists do have a lot of that long-term view. However, they are paid to represent their clients' perspectives. From the advocacy community, a couple unique things that we heard, a little bit different flavor. We heard that, something really is a barrier to equity is that everything at the state legislature is presented in English. There's really a lack of translation services, and Lynn's advocates provide those services themselves. Also heard kind of wrapped up in just the political nature of things that legislators have the luxury of referring anything controversial to the ballot. There's a constant focus on re-election, and often legislators don't want to be associated with a certain issue. So do have that option. And then some of the common themes that we heard from both groups of respondents. We heard loud and clear that the Capitol building itself is really inaccessible and intimidating, and there's very much an elitist environment down at the Capitol, and it's really just can be intimidating and off-putting for many people who are not accustomed to working there. Related to that, it's very much an inside game. So unless you have a lobbyist and have the relationships, it's very hard to navigate the legislative processes, and it's an indicator of how successful an individual, coalition, or community organization will be, whether or not they have access to those relationships and lobbyists. Also heard that there's a real lack of community engagement during legislative session. I can't tell you how many times we heard the phrase that the cake is baked by the time that a bill gets to a committee. Yes, it's great that we have public testimony in every bill, but the sense is that by the time anything reaches committee, the vote count is known. So really the engagement happens during the interim, and there's also a sense that legislators end up relying on the same voices in the process to create their understanding of complex issues. We heard a lot that, we don't pay our staff well at the legislature. We also do not pay our legislators well. Another interesting theme that came up is that there is really a lack of training and support for new legislators. There was a reflection that we've done a really good job getting new legislators elected and involved at the Capitol. However, once they're elected and there, they do not have a lot of supports on just learning how to govern or learning how to do that meaningful community engagement. Heard a lot about political polarization. I have already touched on the power of lobbyists as the holders of relationships and institutional knowledge. And we also heard a lot just around the challenge of the legislative calendar and knowing how to navigate that and find your way to various meetings. A couple issues that are italicized here at the bottom were seen as both pros and cons. We heard a lot around the 120-day constitutional provision of our legislative session. On the positive side, it was noted that this time frame ensures that legislators will pass legislation in a timely fashion. However, on the flip side of that, it was acknowledged that this is not a job that happens in an 120-day span, and work happens throughout the year, and this inevitably ends in an end of session crunch every single year. We heard a lot about remote testimony. That has been one of the silver linings of COVID. Overall, that's seen as a really good thing. However, several of the downsides mentioned were that it has reduced testimony time and has perhaps allowed processes to become more informal. And the last thing we heard an earful around was around legislator term limits, both again seen as a good and a bad. On the positive side, term limits allow for fresh new perspectives and faces in the legislature. So this year we have more than 50% of the legislature or legislators are women, which is exciting. On the flip side of that, we also heard that, again, there's this dynamic that the term limits are putting power unintentionally in the hands of lobbyists, and lobbyists are not elected to represent citizens. So I heard a lot there. So now on to solutions. Here's where people had a lot of fun with this part of the conversation, giving them the magic wand and asking what they would change. So those, again, the insiders, not going to go through all of these, but some of the big themes that came up were a need to address the legislative calendar. And this included anything from modifying within the existing 120-day session to outright restructuring the way that our legislature operates. There were suggestions around alternating every other year from a general legislative session to a budget session, or perhaps splitting the 120 days to a winter session and a summer session, one for the budget and one for bills. Potentially going to a year-round legislature. So again, lots of ideas here. I think this would be an area to explore more if it's of interest, but lots of reflections from those inside the system that the 120 days is a challenge. Again, in the interest of time, won't go through all of this. Heard a lot around lack of media presence down at the Capitol, lack of transparency, for the average citizen to know what's happening down at the Capitol. Heard a lot about the need to bring back bipartisanship, that there have been some unintended consequences of Amendment 41, and that legislators really are not interacting with each other on a human level, and that has created a lot of challenges. Heard about needing legislators to be required to attend committees and their votes in person. Again, remote testimony was seen as a good thing, but legislators being remote was not favorable. A few unique things we heard from advocates were a little bit different flavor, but heard a lot of great ideas around just making the Capitol building more accessible and culturally relevant, somehow placing a limit on paid lobbyists, a lot around trying to provide services for those who are testifying. So childcare, meals, and transportation, as well as making translation services a regular staple down at the Capitol. Also heard some interesting themes around needing to strengthen the pipeline from community into the Capitol. So finding ways to diversify the staff, lobbyists, and legislators who actually get elected. And then some of the common themes, some of these are process themes, just enforce some of the rules that we already have in place, enforce the 5-bill limit. That would really help with some of the timing issues during session. Improve scheduling, a lot around transparency, making it more clear who is working on and driving certain bills. So beyond what is on the Secretary of State website. I think everyone said they want to keep remote testimony. There was a big recommendation and theme around providing support and training for new legislators about how to do community engagement well, how to be a good legislator and to govern. And also, what does it mean? What does it mean to be equitable, and what does equitable policy look like? So it seems like there could be some opportunities there. Heard a lot around repealing or modifying term limits. Again, no single solution there, but some appetite and potentially looking at term limits, making them perhaps 8 years, perhaps looking at in the House having 2 4-year terms instead of 4 2-year terms. That would allow legislators to focus more on making good policy rather than their next campaign. Also heard some ideas around requiring community outreach and engagement on every bill. Don't know what that would look like, but some good ideas there. And again, just strengthening processes. So we heard a lot. I will pause here. I do want to say that some of these recommendations we see as being really process oriented and really valuable. And we hope to get these recommendations into hands of legislative leadership pretty soon. Just say, here are some things you might consider that we've heard that could be implemented this legislative session. But we are interested in hearing from all of you, kind of looking at this range of ideas. Which of these do you actually think might have some potential to make our state bill development process more equitable, inclusive, and transparent? So we're asking you on this poll to pick 2 ideas. No right or wrong answer. We will not hold you to this forever. Again, just looking for a little bit of a temperature check from the room as to what resonates with you and where you might think there could be some progress addressing equity. So I'll give you a couple seconds to put in your gut check answers there. Thank you. All right, looks like we're getting there. Give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I think we're at critical mass. Austin, if you want to close that. All right, thank you. It looks like we have some different ideas on what resonates, but potentially some momentum around the pipeline for leadership into the Capitol, supports for those testifying. Great, thank you. This is really helpful feedback, and thanks for engaging with us in this way. And again, we'll have time to discuss. At this point, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Emily to go through what we heard on the budget side as well as administrative rulemaking.
Hello there. Allow me to extend another warm welcome and thank you to each of you for being here. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you, and we appreciate your time and intentionality in this space and conversation. This second section will cover feedback that we heard concerning the state budget. As Alexis noted in the first section of the presentation, we did hear positive things about the state budget process that we didn't include in this slide, but we wanted to briefly mention it. Folks we talked to praised the Joint Budget Committee's open and accessible meetings, the JBC's strong staffing structure, which includes better pay as compared to other legislative staffers, and the overall quality of work that emerges from the JBC. In terms of barriers that were named, the following themes emerged. From our insiders group, we heard quite a bit about the lack of transparency in figure setting, as well as just the overall political dynamics that are involved in this process, such as having access to a lobbyist, or the way that the governor's office holds a great deal of power in the budget creation process. Some of that overlapping feedback that we heard was around the complexity of the budget process, how difficult it is to follow and understand, and the fact that this too is another element of the policymaking process that is seen as being very much an inside game. These last two items, which we heard about from both groups, fiscal notes and demographic notes, this falls into that mixed bag category that Alexis was mentioning earlier, where whenever these topics came up, they generated feedback that was sometimes really positive and sometimes was held up as a potential barrier. And then for this last group, when we discussed in 2021 with the advocacy community these different topics, we didn't specifically delve into the state budget development and approval process during that time. So the information that was mentioned about the state budget in those conversations last year is entirely represented in that center bubble. So when looking at what can make the budget development and approval process a bit more equitable, the following ideas came forward. From the insiders, they suggested increasing JBC staffing or modifying the budget cycle. And there was a lot of creative ideas that we heard around how that could look. Restructuring or repurposing the SMART Act hearings came up quite a bit. Improving the fiscal note process or requiring demographic notes for all bills instead of just a few. Encouraging community engagement. And this was specifically between community members and JBC members when this came up. And then simply engaging more legislators in the budget making process. From both groups, we heard that process improvements and transparency would be really helpful in this domain. One idea that was advanced was to limit the number of budget amendments. For the second point of making the budget more accessible, we heard a lot about decreasing jargon in the conversations around the budget so that people have a better ability to connect with what's going on. And then again, since this wasn't an area that we specifically asked about in 2021, the feedback from the advocacy community is represented in that center bubble. So we're going to pause here to give everyone the opportunity to weigh in via another Zoom poll. Again, not holding you to any of your responses here, really just looking to get gut reactions on which of these ideas might actually have an impact on making the budget development process more equitable. It's not a complete picture what we've presented here, but please just pick the top two ideas that resonate with you. All right, seeing a good number of responses come in. Just do a few more seconds here. Okay, I think we can just close that out, see what the results are. Okay, scanning through here, looks like making the budget more accessible, easier to understand, and modifying the budget cycle were the top two that resonated with this group. Thank you so much for sharing your feedback on that. Then for this final section, we dove into what happens after a bill becomes a law and is passed from legislators to those who are in charge of implementation. Again, want to mention a couple of the strengths that came up. And one of the things that was really strongly noted was that the Colorado advocacy community is seen as very attentive to and involved in the rulemaking process. And that there are some examples of boards that do community engagement in the rulemaking process pretty well. In terms of the barriers that we heard, the following items were elevated. From the insiders, they talked a lot about just the sheer volume of rulemaking activity and how that leads to overwhelming situations for staff. And also the lack of accountability between branches of government, which can lead to duplication of work. From the advocacy community, we heard really clearly that it's difficult to engage constituents in this area. There is very little true community representation in the rulemaking space, and there's no real equity standard. What we heard there was that there's no process on how to request an equity impact analysis of rules as they're being developed or something of that kind. And then what we heard strongly from both groups was that there's inconsistencies across boards, which make it very difficult to track rulemaking processes and get involved in a meaningful way. Once again, this is an inside game. It's really hard to know how to break into it and to make an impact. And then a general lack of transparency. One respondent put it this way, that rulemaking can be a black hole of information that's difficult to follow, and yet these decisions have a real impact on people's lives, both good and bad. So then in terms of what can make this handoff a little bit more equitable, we heard the following suggestions. From the insiders, they thought that creating a one-stop shop for advocates to access regulatory expertise could be a good approach. Increasing accountability between branches of government. Some of those ideas included having a robust reminder system that would track bills that have passed and the rulemaking that's taken place, or changing the SMART Act hearings to make them a space for policy implementation discussions. Increasing transparency, including in the appointment process, and reducing overall bureaucracy was also elevated. From the advocacy community, we heard that simply enforcing existing public meeting laws would be really helpful. Consolidating boards, especially those with overlapping mandates, providing translation services, and then also requiring intentional outreach to communities who are going to be impacted by rulemaking. And then there was one shared but strongly shared piece of feedback from both groups, which was to standardize formats and procedures across boards. And just simply having consistent language, formatting, and website design could make a really big impact for folks who are trying to understand the process and be involved. So we are almost ready to head into breakout rooms to create more space for discussion around this information. But first, would like to get your gut level feedback one more time on that Zoom poll for what you think could be the top 2 most impactful ideas for advancing equity in the handoff to rulemaking process from these choices. All right, seeing the feedback come in. Just give it a few more seconds here. All right, we can go ahead and close that, share out the results. Let's see. So it looks like requiring intentional outreach to communities impacted was definitely the top one, followed by standardizing formats and procedures across boards. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your feedback on that. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts in the breakout rooms in the next few minutes on a level a bit deeper than what we can achieve with a Zoom poll. I think we're going to have some of the questions that we'll be discussing are going to get dropped into the chat if you'd like to reference them there. But there will also be a facilitator in each of the breakout rooms with prompting questions to just dig a little bit more into some of these themes and get to hear your feedback on that. After connecting for about 8 to 10 minutes in those breakout rooms, we'll come back to this main room for just a quick wrap up conversation, share out from the breakout rooms, and closing of the meeting. So with that, we will head into our breakout rooms in just a second.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone's breakout was as exciting and engaging as my group. Wish we had had an hour with, with everyone to really unpack this. I know our group had some really great ideas that we would love to just popcorn around and get a quick share out. Also had a great question in my group that I promise I will address at the end of this is, what are we going to do with this information? So more on that. I guess I will start with my group if that's okay. And we all sort of voluntold Melanie to help share out for us.
Good day, everyone. I know many of you are members and partners at the Colorado Civic Engagement Roundtable. And I used to work at the Health Foundation. So it is a friendly space. Happy Friday to you. Hope you're all doing well. So I had John Asher from the Colorado Legal Center, Nicole from New Era, Talea from Soul to Soul, and Shar Robert from CCLP, as well as myself and Alexis. And I think the biggest takeaway is that some of us are ordered by our physicians and healthcare providers to stay away from the Capitol. So, and I'm with John on that one. I don't spend much time there. You know, and we talked a lot about term limits and what that means, what the data are saying about the way that our democracy and legislative, judicial, and regulatory branches are set up to do, and how that affects equity and or community engagement, and what does that mean, I think generally for Nicole said it really well, for protecting our democracy, and more importantly for participating in our democracy. And how can the Health Foundation, with its position and power and influence this process? And so those were the big takeaways from ours. We all feel it's very interesting. And I want to end by Shar's comment in that it's really great to see activists and advocates elected to public office, which is happening more and more, and how that particular experience is shaping our democracy and our legislative system in particular.
Thanks, Melanie. You nailed it, even with no notes.
You're welcome.
All right. Kyle or Emily, do you have a nominee from your group to report out?
Yes, Adam, would you be willing to share out from our group?
Sure, I'll do what I can. I think a number of us felt that it was challenging to pick just two of the options in some of those polls, or know how to sort of think about that from a logic standpoint as to sort of which of those might need to come first before others. So I think it was a bit challenging for us in that regard. I think we did talk a fair bit about some of the limitations that Tabor puts on some of these options. For instance, the state and agencies don't even have a line for translation and interpretation in their budget. So how do we start to address that, especially given Tabor constraints of the budget? I think and that sort of also feeds into there needs to be funding for community engagement from the legislators, from the agencies. They don't have the funding or the capacity right now to do that. In many respects, we're pushing them to do it, and in some cases they are or aren't, but they're sort of stretching beyond what they have capacity to do in many cases. And I think the other thing that we talked a little bit about was sort of the calendar and the cadence of things, particularly sessions that come right after an election, are really difficult to sort of plan from an advocacy perspective, because there are so many incoming members that we can't necessarily engage prior to their election because we're 501c3s. And that really limits some of our ability to move things forward more proactively prior to session. And similarly, sort of the timing of the budget and sort of how that disrupts sort of the flow of session and also doesn't allow enough time for constructive feedback.
Thank you so much, Adam. And then our third group.
And I will start with a disclosure from the third group. I failed you all as a facilitator by forgetting to ask if somebody wanted to volunteer to sort of share and reflect what we talked about in our room with the rest of the group. I will leave space for somebody to step into that role if they would like, and if not, you're stuck with me. All right, here and none. Well, first of all, we had a wonderful discussion in my room, so I really appreciate the folks who happened to be paired with me in the Zoom small room and all that as well. A few things that sort of resonated or sort of stuck with me from our conversation was that sort of this reflection about the turnover in the legislators and sort of the impact that it has for good or for bad in terms of institutional memory and all that, and just knowledge about the process and the issues that the legislature deals with is not confined to the folks in those legislative seats, that turnover is real, present, and has dynamics for the staff of the legislature, the staff of the executive branch, and staff of our own organizations and the advocacy ecosystem as well, too. And so being able to understand that like turnover is a real thing. People change positions, and whether they leave the ecosystem entirely and sort of step away from the policymaking process altogether, or just move to a different seat, a different role in it as well, like that is something that fuels some of this insider game and all that was noted across both sets of interviews as well. One of the other things that our friends at Good Business Colorado talked about in some of the work that they're doing right now about bringing a sense of fun to the legislative process was really striking for me and for some other members in our small group of like, across all the conversations that we had last year with advocates and then with these insiders to the game, that was not a word that came up in any of these conversations as well. And so that was just striking to me personally. It's like, huh. And then many of the organizations in our small group sort of reflected on work that they had been doing individually and to some extent in partnership or collectively to train, to sort of coach members of their organizations that have a sort of formal membership model or their community partners about how to understand and demystify what the process is and all that as well, and sort of a sense of, is there a better way to point people to resources that already exist to understand like how to do testimony, the process, the procedures of that, how to navigate the building of the Capitol or the remote testimony process and those kinds of things too, where we may be doing that individually in silos, but there may be some opportunity for us to collaborate across organizations to sort of chip away at, I think, what we heard across both sets of data collection that the foundation did, both from the advocates and then these insiders to the process, that sort of intimidation factor, the insiders game is very real, both for the insiders to the process, people serving in the seats or in staff roles and that, but then also community members that we're trying to bring more and more into this process. And so thinking through like as an ecosystem, is there a better, more collaborative way that we can do some of that stuff together?
All right, thank you, Kyle. And I know we are at time, if you can bear with me for 2 more minutes. Clearly, there are no shortage of good ideas here, and I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface in these conversations. So thank you all for your time, for your engagement, and for your willingness to have this conversation with us in the first place. In terms of next steps, I think we have a commitment at the foundation. We do not like to put out reports that then collect dust on shelves. We really do want to make things actionable. So in the very near term, we will be going through the findings. First, we're going to be sort of finalizing and putting the second report out there in the public domain. None of this is secret. We do feel that there are a series of recommendations that are process and procedural issues that we would like to get into the hands of legislative leadership right now. So we will be doing that and taking that information and using our voice to share what we've heard collectively from community. We also will be making sure that these materials and resources are in all of your hands in a way that is usable and helpful to you. So we'll be following up and getting some feedback from all of you about how else you might be able to use this information, what would be helpful. And then I think, as we started to just discuss today, I think there's some bigger, longer term issues here that we think are probably worth taking on with an eye towards increasing equity in the processes. Don't know that we've landed on what those are and what that will look like. However, what we do know is that we will not be doing that work alone. So we'll be looking to other organizations who might be interested in partnering on this, lending your thought, leadership, and ideas. But as Melanie referenced, we do recognize that the Health Foundation, we do have a platform and we do have some influence. So we would like to use that for good. And again, we'll be looking to all of you to figure out what that should look like moving forward. So thank you in advance for your continued partnership. That said, we do have one final poll question for you. We would love, again, we don't quite know what the exact next steps and path forward on this looks like. We know there is a path forward and it may be meandering, but we'd love to just hear how and if you would like to be engaged. Again, just kind of preliminary gut check. If you do not want to be engaged in this conversation, we will, no harm there. We will absolutely take you off the list. But if you are interested and excited about this, we would love to be in touch in the weeks and months ahead. Looks like we're getting to critical mass there. Okay, let's close that in 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. All right, looks like there's some interest in continuing to be engaged. So you will be hearing from us. Final detail, just in terms of follow-up, we will be sharing out a meeting summary, all meeting materials, the slides, the reports when we have them. We may also be following up with you for some additional feedback, any additional ideas that you've had after this conversation. We also are going to be doing one more round of interviews, digging in more around rulemaking. So we will be looking to you for ideas around who would be good people to contact, to interview, to share ideas about what might be some opportunities to make the rulemaking processes in our state more equitable. So more fun ahead. Again, thank you so much for your time today. So much gratitude for all of you and the amazing work that you do. I hope you are headed into a restful weekend. Wish you all the best and good luck this legislative session, or stay away from the Capitol, John. Follow your doctor's advice. Again, take care. Happy Friday. Happy weekend. We'll be in touch. Bye, everyone.